Hello.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening to you.
Welcome to today's edition of the Bosnia Sancak Academic Culture and History Foundation's webinar series. Today we will be focusing on the past, present and the future of the Dayton Peace Agreement. We approach the 25th anniversary of the Dayton Agreement, formally entitled as the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This agreement established the political divisions and the current government structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Joining us for this webinar, we have Dr. Colum Murphy, who gracefully accepted our invitation to speak on the Dayton Agreement. I would now like to say a few words to introduce our speaker, although I know that the following will not do justice to his reputation. Colum Murphy is a citizen of the Republic of Ireland. He is the founder and president of the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations in Switzerland. Formerly, Dr. Murphy served the United Nations and international community for more than 30 years. He has served on the staff of several Secretaries General of the United Nations and worked for years with the UN Security Council in peacekeeping and as human rights officer. He was Special Assistant for Security Council Affairs before becoming a specialist in negotiations for peace in conflict areas. He served in international community in a number of wars, including the Bosnian War. As UN Deputy Head of Political Affairs inside Bosnia, Murphy negotiated the 1994-95 winter ceasefire and later the cessation of hostilities agreement. He spent a total of 4 years in Bosnia during and after the war, and his book As a Beast, Attacking the Roots of War, won worldwide acclaim. We, as the BSA Foundation, had the distinct pleasure of welcoming Dr. Murphy to speak on his book As a Beast in May 2016 at a seminar organized by us. Without further ado, Dr. Murphy, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Leyla, thank you so much for your warm invitation. I just hope that I can be of help in your webinar. It's a very important anniversary, and I'm very grateful both for your past and now your overwhelming present hospitality. So I'm in your hands. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation yet again. It is a pleasure to have you this evening.
Thank you.
If I may, I think before we assess the Dayton agreements, as you had spent more than 4 years in Sarajevo, maybe you would like to share with us your anecdotes or experiences or certain feelings pertaining to the time that you spent there during and after the war.
Well, yes, one or two things always come to mind. And since we're all living through and struggling with COVID-19, I'm thinking, I don't know, it's also in connection with wars I've been through, of something the French writer Albert Camus said. He said, man never expects the plague, and man never expects war. But the plague always comes, and war always comes. And you know, when war came initially to Bosnia, to Sarajevo, since it has been struggling with issues of economic nature, it's nevertheless a very sophisticated city. And people sat, as we all do, in outdoor cafes and drank their cappuccinos and said, well, war occurred elsewhere. And war, of course, is not going to happen to us. It never happens to us, it happens to somebody else. And yet war came to them. We have spent years and years in our university bringing to the attention of young students the fact that many problems that they need to learn to deal with are global. But this may be the first generation that has experienced a plague, as Albert Camus called it, a pandemic, and they can see for themselves that tragedies in their own community are worldwide problems. So, as Franklin Roosevelt used to say, let us never waste a crisis. It may be easier for young people today to draw conclusions from, indeed, the Dayton Agreement, from this COVID-19, from the sense that we are all one family. And this I say also because, as we'll get to later, Bosnia appears sadly to be sliding back into a kind of tribalism. And I'm afraid that's mirrored in other places, including in the United States. So in one way, marking the anniversary of Dayton is extremely important, and we should focus on lessons we can learn from that and they are all around us, even at the moment, as we watch what is happening in different countries, like in the United States, for example, where society seems more divided than ever. So Dayton has a lot to tell us. Anecdotes, let me focus on one. I spent a lot of time in Bosnia crossing the no man's land and shuttling between the Sarajevo government and the wartime headquarters of the Pale Serbs who were besieging Sarajevo. All of this, of course, before the Dayton Agreement brought it all to an end. And one evening I was there. We dined with Karadzic and Mladic and others, monsters that they were. And I was seen looking at one of the bottles of wine on the dinner table. And Karadzic said to me, "Do you like our wine, Mr. Murphy?" And I said, "Yes, it's very good, thank you." So he ordered a waiter to give me a bottle of this wine to bring back to Sarajevo with me. So I did that. And when we eventually made our way through the snow and the forests and the darkness to the shut out Sarajevo, the besieged Sarajevo, if you've ever seen a city with no lights and no water, it's a very striking thing. And eventually, exhausted, I let my driver go and climbed to, there was no electricity, of course. I climbed to my fourth floor apartment and put the bottle of wine that Dr. Karadzic had given me on the night table and fell fast asleep. Then about 4 o'clock in the morning, a Serb shell hit the building and indeed hit where my apartment was. So there was a tremendous noise and a huge cloud of smoke and plaster falling from the ceiling and so on. I woke up with a shock, and to my horror, the entire bed was red. I thought, of course, that perhaps I'd lost my legs, some terrible thing had happened. And when the dust started to clear, I realized that I was in one piece, I was intact. And that it was, in fact, the bottle of red wine that had spilled all over the bed. So, being as I was in those days, I drank a shot of whiskey, which I'm not very addicted to, occasionally, and I smoked a cigarette and you know, got myself back together and collected myself. And a day or two passed, and I decided to go back to the Serb headquarters to claim, being Irish, you know, we're like that, to claim my bottle of wine. So we set off in an armored vehicle, the bodyguard and so on, drove again through the snow, and I went back to see Karadzic, who, as you know, is now serving a 40-year prison term in the UN prison in The Hague. And I said, "I want my bottle of wine back." And he was embarrassed, and he thought this was some sort of bizarre joke. But I made sure to stay until I got the wine. And he said, "You know, probably those Muslims did it." I said, "No, the shell came from exactly the same place that you fire them from and have been firing at the city for years." So that's an amusing little anecdote. But what it tells us is that if all politics are local, which they are in a way, they are also global. And the enemy very often is in the very neighborhood, often behind our own lines, or often very close at hand. So we have to be extremely careful about how we go forward and learn things about the dangers of tribalism, the dangers of people relying only on ethnicity, and the huge global repercussions of all these little anecdotes that they have lessons to tell us about the world as a whole. Anyway, that's my anecdote. But let's, I think, try to draw, after you pose your questions, some lessons from indeed, the Dayton Agreement.
Certainly. The anecdote was very striking. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. Not going through a war, a person has a difficulty understanding what the then current situation, the physical conditions are. And yeah, it gives us a very clear picture as to what the reality of the region was. So thank you very much.
Could you speak a little louder, Leyla?
Can you hear me better now?
Now we're good, yes. Thank you.
Good. If it's okay, I think we could proceed with the Dayton Agreement and speaking on maybe the then conditions that were present under which the Dayton Agreement was signed. Would you like to elaborate on what the events that were leading to the agreement were and why the agreement was structured the way it was structured?
Well, I may take that in a different format exactly. Just before the Dayton Agreement, the NATO bombing campaign started, and that ultimately brought Milosevic to the conference table. The three main signatories of the Dayton Agreement are no longer with us. So the Dayton Agreement, flawed as it is, has actually survived all three main signatories. President Izetbegovic, President Franjo Tudjman, and President Milosevic. And the agreement came only because I think the international community finally added to its carrots a certain number of sticks. Very often you cannot get an agreement without carrots and sticks. It brought them to the table. It put an end to the killing. It brought peace. But it was an immense amount of work, immense energy on the part of Richard Holbrooke, the American leading diplomat, immense efforts to quarantine all of these leaders in one place, the Wright-Patterson Air Base in Dayton, and many glitches had to be overcome before the agreement was signed. At the very last minute, President Izetbegovic, for reasons I understand, was almost backing out. But in the end, all three signed because it brought an end to the killing, it brought peace. But one of the lessons is that an imperfect agreement is very possibly going to surface again and produce difficulties later on. So it's a dilemma that we have seen throughout history. At what point do you stop looking for the perfect agreement? And the Dayton Agreement was brilliant, in fact, brilliantly successful for the first 10 years. Instead of three ethnic communities in Bosnia, it insisted on one country. And in the first 10 years, the international community being focused on the problem, as is far less at the moment, managed to integrate the armies even that had fought each other, the police forces, produced a joint customs administration, brought many elections to their successful conclusion. And now, sadly, it's the international community that has taken its eye off the ball and allowed the unraveling, if you will, of Dayton, so that we see us sliding back towards a darker Bosnia based, unfortunately, on three ethnic communities. Over to you.
Thank you. I am getting the impression that based on the then current conditions when the Dayton Agreement was signed, you think that it was a success. Do you believe that it was a fair and equitable peace accord, bearing in mind the parties involved in the conflict?
It was not as fair as it should be, no, not at all. But if you think in terms of, say, domestic violence, in the case of a divorce, and by the way, scientists spend a lot of time these days studying divorces and bringing lessons to international relations. Isn't it usually a good thing to, first of all, stop the violence, establish dialogue, establish some sort of communications that are civilized, rather than wait until it's decided as to who gets which of the furniture and who gets the house and who gets the children and so on. It's an imperfect agreement, but it worked for a number of years. That's my answer.
Thank you. Well, that is certain. It did bring peace to the area. But there have been, from a very limited research that I have conducted, there have been criticisms that the ceasefire and then later the peace agreement came at a time just when the Bosnian forces were gaining force and starting to advance and actually trying to get a successful result of their own resistance. But yes, as you say, it is actually a place where you decide to stop the killing. So it is an imperfect time. It is an imperfect agreement. Yeah.
Well, that in history is usually what happens, that a winning side, it doesn't matter if they are, how virtuous or otherwise they are, is usually stopped in its tracks before it goes any further. A similar armistice or ceasefire occurred when Israel was in one of its wars and eventually broke out and broke back across the Suez Canal and was rushing towards Cairo when the Americans stepped in and stopped them. Because there's a moment at which international diplomats think, well, this side or that side is winning, but if it goes any further, we will have no chance whatsoever of getting them to the peace table.
I understand. Thank you very much for your answer. Do you believe that at the time they put a stop to the war, they signed the armistice, they decided to come to the table and discuss and negotiate a Dayton peace agreement under the then current conditions on that day, a different peace accord was possible, or at that time this was what they could finally agree upon? It is an exposed assessment, I understand. From today's perspective, it's very easy to criticize that day's conditions, but I am curious about what your opinion on that is.
There's no question about it. Yes, many other kinds of agreement would have been possible, but there's almost always one human actor who is very energetic, very focused, very committed. At that time, that was Richard Holbrooke. And he exerted enormous efforts and energies and constant shuttling back and forwards to get all of these people to Dayton, Ohio. And it was his energy and his colleagues' energy that kept them all at the table. Yes, of course, there could have been a different kind of agreement later or earlier or further down the road, or depending on who was putting this together. But that was what was possible at the time. Even Holbrooke's superiors wondered if he could pull it off, and then they were glad to see that he had put so much energy into it. But of course, somebody else or other groups might have done things differently in a different place at a later time, of course.
You said in your answers that the Dayton Agreement for the first 10 years actually was a success. It's united the communities, it united the police force, it united the military, and the international community actually had a correct angle, a correct perspective. In the long term, then you said that the international community took their eye off the ball and then things started to go south. How do you believe that the structure of the Dayton Agreement has shaped and affected the current status now we go through in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Do you believe that the Dayton Agreement is a reason for certain malfunctions or deadlocks in the government and in the administration of the country?
Yes, absolutely. Now the point is where the Dayton Agreement can be seen as a negative force, because it froze things in place. So it left the divorced couple, if you will, feeling that what they got, they're never going to give up, that they should have gotten more in this divorce, but by golly, they got this and they got that, and they're not going to retreat from that. So what has happened is that Dayton contributed in some ways, once the international community was focused on pulling the country together, but once if you like, the police moved away from this domestic violence, it was clear that certain domestic problems had not been solved at all, which is typical of all conflicts. So in some ways, Bosnia is ungovernable at the moment. It froze situations in place, often where a town could not agree on whether it should have a Muslim or a Croat or a Serb mayor. They solved it by saying, let's have 3 of them. There are cities and towns and communities in Bosnia that have 3 administrations and so many bureaucrats bumping into each other that it's a huge recipe, which if you like, if you come from one school of thought, can be blamed on Dayton. A recipe for a kind of chaos, a kind of glacier moving downhill with all sorts of things stuck in the ice that are not very good having there. Your turn.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. Your turn.
Thank you. I was wondering, in your experience, do you believe that a revision of the Dayton Agreement or the negotiation and enactment of a new accord is necessary?
It's necessary, but it's not going to happen.
That was my next question. Is it feasible?
Yeah, no, it's necessary, but again, like any divorce agreement, it could be a lot better. What's happening now is that all the politicians, even those of the most cosmopolitan outlook, are focusing on working only with their own ethnic communities. And that's the case for all three. Dodik, for example, is leading, doesn't believe in one country. He thinks in terms constantly of Greater Serbia. Croatia is even talking about Herzegovina being a special electoral entity, whatever that is. And the Muslim community, even with those who were colleagues of Haris Salajic and others, focusing on their own politics. So they're not getting the necessary help from the referee, if you like, which was the international community. So is it feasible? I don't think it's feasible. No, it's needed, but it's not feasible. If you remove a fair referee from a football game, a game which, you know, turned violent from time to time, then things degenerate. Do you need a new referee? You certainly do. But if the players are so silly that they threw the referee out, then they may hesitate as to what new referee comes on or what color he is. So I don't think it's going to happen, no. In fact, I want us also to draw conclusions for the world as a whole. Now, here's a subject I'm not going to get into this evening, but at the moment, as has happened so often in history, Turkey and Greece are arguing about energy and drilling in the sea and so on. I'm not going to get into that subject, but what all of this teaches us, Dayton and all the history of wars since time immemorial, is that if we focus on only our own interests and not see things from the other fellow's point of view, the world is putting itself in more and more danger. The 20th century, as you know, was the most destructive of all time. And still remaining is the danger of nuclear war, the dangers from climate change, the downside of social media, all sorts of things. And now what's happening in the United States is, to everyone's amazement, a new kind of tribalism. It seems as if social media brings us together, but also divides us more. So whether it's in your own country or your own region, it's a very good case study, Dayton, for what happens when people revert to a less universal point of view. Is it feasible? Is it needed? Yes, it's needed, but is it feasible? I don't think so. What is really needed is that our young people, especially, who are more familiar with social media and who've seen for themselves a worldwide pandemic, that hopefully they will be more conscious of the ultimate dangers and the terrible renewed dangers of tribalism.
Thank you. Definitely, the subject that we are tackling today is something that we need to look at from a global scale, and the current developments, like you stated, show without any doubt how important giving regard to that is, and how dangerous the current polarization and tribalism, as you put it, is. But as you stated, even though it is maybe not feasible to discuss a renegotiation of the Dayton Agreement, when we come back to the regional problem at Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have a non-governable situation. The status quo is not something that can be sustained in the long term. Is there any way out that you see? Is there any way, any steps that need to be taken to ameliorate the situation at the region? What is your opinion on that?
I think we should think beyond the borders of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is heading backwards. That is true. Look at the new tribalism in Britain with Brexit. And this is making Scotland thinking of becoming independent of the United Kingdom. Look what's happening on the continent of Europe with refugee questions. The massive influx of displaced people that have come, say, to Europe. Look what's happening with the borders closed in Spain or Italy because of COVID-19. I think what the pandemic and the breakup of certain things in Bosnia-Herzegovina are trying to tell us is, for heaven's sake, you humans, it's time to think again on a larger scale. Where I'm sitting at the moment, Leyla, you know, I'm just next door to the United Nations. And no one expected conflict in 1913. And it was so horrific that they established next door to where I am, the League of Nations, so that war would never occur again. And yet within a generation, we had the Second World War. But after the Second World War, there's a coming together always after such horror of global thinking, of a sense of humanity as one species. And now we need that again. What's happening to Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think we have to see in a regional context and try to encourage, with the help of all those great young people, a more continental view, a more regional view. And the solutions for Bosnia and Herzegovina will lie within that new infusion of idealism and humanitarianism. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to one of your views that you have expressed previously, if I'm not mistaken. I believe it is your view that the international community has incessantly promised to never enable a genocide, but has not kept this promise and failed Bosnia time and time again. Unfortunately, Bosnia is not alone in this. The international community has failed many communities who were faced with many humanitarian crimes, including genocide, time and time again. Even today, in the face of a humanitarian crisis, we see that abundant silence. Do you believe that the Dayton Agreement was a landmark somehow, was a turning point in the international community's point of view or the actions? Do you believe that the international community did a better job after that agreement? Do you believe that there was an improvement thereafter, or do you believe that we are still incredibly failing and we need to actually make a big change and very soon?
A number of things there. Dayton was an imperfect agreement. It brought peace, it stopped the killing, but it didn't solve the problems. It worked well enough, indeed, quite well according to some, for the first 10 years. Then the international community took its eye off that. Do we need to internationally focus better and see the big picture? Absolutely. You know, scientists tell us that our planet as a whole is about 4.5 billion years old. And scientists also tell us that Homo sapiens appeared either about 300,000 years ago or a little less, depending on how you measure that. But if you subtract the latter, the figure regarding the appearance of Homo sapiens, say 300,000, from 4.5 billion, it's strikingly clear that planet Earth was empty of humans for most of its existence. By far, for most of its existence. There it was, our planet turning around silently in God's domain around the sun for so long a time. And what it has done before, it can do again. Common sense tells us that. So unless we find, maybe with the inspiration of this pandemic and other things that are global, like global warming, let us never waste a crisis. Unless we come together quickly and understand that we must move rapidly to not only produce the Daytons, but to keep our eye on the ball, that we must inject new vigor into the United Nations, which is not them, by the way. The United Nations is us. Unless we, all of us, have a much less tribal view, and unless we keep on pushing that stone uphill, then the planet really is in very great imminent danger. So let's draw lessons from Dayton. It wasn't so bad. It did its job for a time. Let's draw our lessons from what's happening with the pandemic. Let's draw our lessons from what happened to Bosnia and Herzegovina, where neighbors who lived together in peace for so many decades turned on each other and not only killed each other, but did so savagely. Unless we reawake to the task ahead of us as a planet, we are in deep trouble. So much of our days are spent looking at artificial intelligence and the advances of technology. But possibly the big question of the 21st century may be the difference between artificial intelligence and consciousness. It's not enough simply to advance our artificial technology and our other technological toys. Unless we are more and more conscious of our spiritual nature and of our nature as one species, then we are in absolute danger of returning our planet to how it has been long before we humans came along.
Definitely. When we look at the large scale, how insignificant humans and even the Earth is in the cosmos is striking, definitely.
Yes, Shakespeare put it this way: we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with the sleep.
True. But when you look from a person's perspective, inevitably they tend to see the smaller picture of their region, of their tribe, as you put it, and of what they have gone through. And even though there is this need to look at this from a global perspective and to approach this as a global community, especially when you look at the members of a community that has suffered, that have been the victim of inexplicable acts, from their point of view, they have an expectation of justice, of being served their rights, of being witnesses of the rights of justice being established. And in that phase, sometimes this is very difficult for them to let go of how they have been wronged and look at things from a global perspective. And when we look at the Bosnian community, the immigrant community also here in Turkey, the way that we are approaching the situation is, well, the conditions were unjust and there needs to be something that has to be done about it. But I completely understand that if we keep this up, new crises, new wars will inevitably take place. And yeah, we will be destroying humanity as we know it, without doubt.
Yes, but I go back to Bosnia quite often, and I've seen, and with my own eyes, former prisoners talking to their former torturers, not falling in love with each other, but trying to understand, how on earth did we go through that? How on earth did we do those things? But even if you were right and I was wrong, or I was wrong or you were right, and even if it's impossible to forget certain traumas and torments, we're older now and we do not want this for our children. Whoever is right and wrong, and we know who the aggressor was. I made many speeches at the time that the United Nations was on the wrong track. You cannot find a halfway point between genocide and rape. There was a rapist and there was a rape victim. And asking them to kiss and make up is not only wrong, it's obscene. But what you can do is to educate people and let them see that the truth will out, because the truth always does out. And all people, no matter of what persuasion, do not want to go back to something like that for their children. So I've seen reconciliation, but the economy is in very bad shape in Bosnia. There's this consumerism now that has covered things like a chocolate covering on a cake, fancy malls and commerce centers and so on, right next door to people who are really struggling just to make ends meet and get through the week or the month, to put food on the table and so on. Can we imagine a Dayton Agreement, a new Dayton Agreement? We can imagine it, but it's not going to happen. But what we can imagine are new relations and new types of relations in Europe. And indeed, let me say this, new types of relations between, say, Greece and Turkey, and new types of relations between the United States and Latin America, and new types of relations between China and the rest of the world. Unless we think bigger, there's going to be more trauma at the local level, and our planet is in real danger. That's my answer.
Thank you. And I would like to dwell a little bit more on that point as to what all of us need to do. As you are aware, there is a big community in Turkey consisting of immigrants from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they have established many non-governmental organizations, one of which is the Bosnia Sancak Academic History and Culture Foundation, which is hosting this webinar today. Do you believe that this...
Sorry, go ahead with your question.
Do you believe that this community or the Turkish state or the non-governmental organizations, not necessarily within a nation, but in an international scale, need to play a role in the next steps to be taken in Bosnia? You said that we can imagine new types of relations, not necessarily specifically for the region, but from a global scale. But what do you think the role of these non-governmental organizations, of these communities, should be in this concrete example?
Well, first of all, I have many dear friends in that community, and the Bosnian Muslims were those who suffered the most, by far. And I am dearly committed. Many of them are in my heart forever. And if they have better economic conditions, perhaps in Turkey or elsewhere, they should avail of their clout, of their influence, of their newfound either prosperity or better conditions to help Bosnia. But, dear friends, I say help both communities, help all three communities, and set an example of what a modern democratic man or woman is like. Don't just help your own community. Show people and show the world how this is done democratically. Your role, and indeed your suffering, has been huge, but your role is extremely important. So, reach out to the other communities as well, and that, as Dr. Martin Luther King would say, totally disarms an enemy. It might not have been possible actually in wartime, but it's certainly possible now for those fine members of the Bosnian refugee community to show exactly the great things they're capable of. And that's why I touched on Greece and Turkey. Reach out to the other fellow. It's your own children who will benefit. That's my answer.
Thank you. That was very inspiring, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I may, I want to proceed with a rather personal question.
Yes, please go ahead.
In a newspaper article written by Professor Dr. Adem Fazlıoğlu, who was the former president of the board of our foundation and who was the speaker introducing you before the seminar that you participated in here in Istanbul, he argued that you didn't play by the rules and you didn't go as certain other UN officials and got along better with the British representatives instead of making and standing by your insightful and brave remarks, bearing in mind the long-term implications of the steps taken. Actually, I can see that from the entire webinar that we had with you today as well. We are looking at even a regional conflict from a very global point of view because it is a humanitarian issue. His argument is that had you played by the rules, you would have been in much higher ranks in the international institutions, even as high as the Secretary General of the United Nations. Would you like to comment on this remark, or do you agree with his observations?
Yes, actually I agree. And in the end, I'm glad that my friend Antonio Gutierrez won the position. But, you know, we can and we should only plan a certain amount of our lives. Every so often, we are confronted with roundabouts, forks in the road where we have to follow conscience. And I never intended not to follow my conscience. So certain things, when you see certain atrocities, and especially the cruelties visited upon the Bosnian Muslims, then certain things, as they said at the Nuremberg trials even, certain things are written on the heart of man. And I have no regrets whatsoever that I followed my conscience and spoke as I did. And if I hadn't, I might be much busier now, had a slightly different career, but also a lot of headaches. So I'm happy with how things are, yes.
Thank you very much for showing a very inspirational example for making us believe that we can actually go with our conscience and do the right thing. I think that you really give us courage in that regard. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think, by the way, that we must never do otherwise. There are organizations where you have to resign if your conscience comes in clash with the organization, but there are not so very many of them. Usually, if we want to, and as we should follow our conscience and follow principles that are humanitarian and decent, and then let the chips fall where they may. So I know there are many heroes and heroines among your Bosnian community in Turkey. My sympathies and heart is with you. I urge you to continue doing the fine things you are. And if you're better off than some of your comrades in Bosnia, please reach out not only to your own community, but to the other communities as well. And that way, your NGO will continue to do the fine work that it has been doing for so long. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Dr. Murphy. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
It was my pleasure, and good luck to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck to you as well. Good evening.
Bye-bye.